This is an AI-generated image posted by the US President Donald Trump on his Truth Social, showing him with an American flag on Greenland next to a sign that says US territory established 2026. This is openly saying that he will take over the territory of an ally, close ally, a NATO ally, Denmark. He's posting AI-generated images as the president of the United States. And he has threatened European countries with tariffs if the Greenland issue isn't resolved in his liking. And he's also not ruled out using military force. So it's clear that we might see another trade war between the United States and Europe. And this time, I would like to make the argument that we in Europe need to act stronger than we did last time. And there is a discussion in Europe about this right now. Macron, the French president, is urging the EU to use the so-called Trade Bazooka in response to Trump's tariffs. But there seems to be a split where many people in Brussels within the EU call for restraint. This was said. Our priority is to engage, not escalate. Commission Deputy Spokesperson Olaf Gill told reporters. Sometimes the most responsible form of leadership is restraint, and responsible leadership is what President von der Leyen and indeed the European Union as a whole are about. Then its use is strongly backed. This is all from the Euroactiv article, by the way. Its use is strongly backed by France, but resisted by Italy, Poland, and many Eastern EU countries who fear that Washington could retaliate by withdrawing military support for Ukraine or NATO. And concerning Germany, there seems to be mixed signals, because the Vice Chancellor Klingbeil backed the use of the Trade Bazooka, but the Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who's in coalition with, he's from the Christian Democrats, and he's in a coalition with the Social Democrats, who Klingbeil is from, and the Chancellor hasn't yet backed the move. But what is this so-called Trade Bazooka then, and why should we use it? So it's officially called the Anti-Coercion Instrument, ACI, but it's usually referred to as the Trade Bazooka. It was adopted in 2023 precisely to protect the EU from economic coercion, like now. And it includes several different countermeasures, tariffs, but also the ability to limit access to the EU's single market and to limit access to public procurement, government contracts, and it can also affect intellectual property rights. And it can be used to target, countries, companies, and individuals. So it's a tool with broad instruments to be able to strike back against economic coercion against the EU. But it does need qualified majority in the council to be able to be used, which is why for the EU to use it, we need a lot of consensus. And why does the EU need to respond this strongly? At least according to my opinion. Well, as I see it, and I think it's very clear, is that Trump only respects strength. If you try to appease or compromise, he won't see you as amenable or a good ally. He will just see you as weak, and he will try to extract more from you in the future. He doesn't honor his agreements. The only way to actually deter him is to show force. Even if you can, by compromising and by trying to de-escalate, even if you can come to some sort of understanding, you don't know what Trump will think in a year. maybe he will just ignore the deal and try to get even more concessions from you. And I think that has been pretty clear. I mean, last year, the EU gave a lot of concessions to Trump, in this trade deal that was signed that was agreed to between the US and the EU, where many people describe this as humiliating for the EU because the EU basically removed all tariffs against the US, while the US still had 15% against most goods from the EU. So many saw it as a very unfair deal, but it was done. The argument was that at least now we have long-term security and we have a deal. But as we've seen now, Trump threatens new tariffs because if he doesn't get what he wants with Greenland. So that deal was clearly not a guarantee for long-term security. And that's my whole point. Trump only understands strength. And I can see the argument that we need to de-escalate and that a trade war could, escalate to really hurt the EU economy. But I think that long term, the only actually viable solution is to respond strong, use the instruments at our disposal, and make Trump back down. Because even if it will hurt the EU economy, it will certainly also hurt the US economy. And seeing now how Trump is really suffering in the polls on affordability and the economy, I think a strong European response could make him back down, because Trump seems to be very responsive to the stock markets and the economy, so he will not have the willingness to continue a trade war where the EU actually responds. And right now the EU has said that if the US tariffs goes into effect, the EU has prepared more tariffs themselves, but they haven't yet decided to use the Trade Bazooka. So it's not that we're not doing anything right now. We are preparing some tariffs of our own, but I think that we need to have a mindset where we are more ready to use the instruments at our disposal and not be afraid to actually take up the fight against Trump. Because if we are afraid, if we do not show our strength, then short term and long term, we will not get a good deal with the US, and the US will not respect us, because right now the US president only respects strength and ignores long-term relationships with his allies. But that's just my opinion on the matter. But yeah, thanks for watching.